The kitchen smelled faintly of roasted turkey and pine, a scent that usually brought comfort. I had spent the entire morning polishing silverware, arranging napkins, and quietly anticipating laughter, warmth, and the kind of family togetherness that only Christmas could conjure. My heart fluttered with a mix of hope and apprehension, imagining my grandchildren's eager chatter and the hum of shared stories around the table. It had been months since we'd all gathered, and I allowed myself a quiet excitement, savoring the thought of being part of something bigger than myself. I wonder, have you ever walked into a room expecting warmth and belonging, only to feel the sharp sting of being set aside by those you love the most? That question has haunted me as I fumbled with the final preparations, pretending I was simply helping rather than bracing for what I feared might come. And then it happened. My son's wife, with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, told me to sit in the kitchen. The words landed heavier than the Christmas roast itself, carrying a sting that reverberated through my chest and pinned me in place. A shiver of disbelief mixed with quiet anger ran down my spine, and for a moment, I wondered whether this family, this holiday, had room for me at all. The words still echoed in my mind as I stepped toward the kitchen, a place I had long associated with preparation and service, rather than seating for family meals. The polite command felt like an invisible wall, separating me from the laughter and warmth I had pictured. I carried the platter of roasted vegetables in my hands, my fingers gripping the edges as if holding on to some fragile dignity. Every step seemed heavier than the last, and I noticed my heart beating not with excitement, but with a quiet tension that tightened my chest. I set the vegetables on the counter, careful not to spill a drop, and looked around the small space that would serve as my temporary table. The kitchen had always been the heart of our house, filled with the smell of simmering sauces and the hum of chatter from family gatherings. Today, though, it felt smaller, sharper, a space made for exclusion rather than comfort. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window above the sink, and for the first time in a long while, I saw the weight of my own hesitations pressed into the lines of my face. I thought back to other Christmases, long ago when the children were small and their laughter filled every corner of the house. The living room was warm, fragrant with pine and baked goods, and I had moved among them freely, unnoticed yet content. I had worn my role quietly, preparing meals, arranging gifts, and listening to stories that did not center on me. I remembered the pride in their eyes when they received a carefully chosen present, the way my spouse had always glanced at me with unspoken gratitude. Those days were gone, and a subtle ache lingered in the gap left behind. From my perch near the counter, I could hear the muffled sound of conversation from the dining room. My son laughed at something his wife had said, a sound that should have felt ordinary in a way that did not pierce the chest. But today, it reminded me that I had been moved aside, rendered invisible in a moment meant to celebrate family togetherness. My fingers fiddled with the hem of my sweater, and I found myself silently rehearsing the questions I could ask to remind them of my presence. But I stopped, realizing confrontation in that moment would only fuel tension without granting the satisfaction I sought. Instead, I retreated to memories. I thought about the years I had poured into making this family function, the quiet sacrifices no one ever mentioned. Late nights spent cleaning, early mornings making breakfast, listening to complaints without complaint. I remembered the countless times I had swallowed my own frustration so that the children could shine, so that the house could appear perfect for company. And now, as I sat in the kitchen, the invisible barrier between me and the dining room felt heavier than any roast or decoration could ever be. I noticed the subtle ways the family's attention danced elsewhere, the ease with which they ignored my presence. A plate clattered in the dining room, a burst of laughter erupted, and I found myself shrinking into the corner, though I did not move an inch. My mind wandered to the moments when my own input was overlooked, decisions made without asking, opinions brushed aside, a voice softened to a whisper to avoid disruption. The sting of repetition cut sharper because it had become familiar, a pattern I had tolerated so long it had begun to feel almost inevitable. I decided to pour myself a cup of tea, not as a concession to my exclusion but as a moment to ground myself. The steam curled upward, the aroma familiar and oddly comforting, a reminder that even in moments of being set aside, there could still be warmth and control. I let the kettle's whistle guide my breathing, counting each inhale and exhale, reminding myself that the table might not include me now, but it could not define the worth of my presence. I thought about the deed, folded neatly in my bag, tucked out of sight. It had been months in preparation, a quiet safeguard for a time like this, when patience and foresight would matter more than immediate recognition. I allowed myself a small, private smile, imagining the expressions of surprise and realization that would eventually come when I chose the moment. That smile felt like the first breath of empowerment in the midst of the suffocating tension around me. From the corner of the kitchen, I watched a minor mishap in the dining room. A spilled glass of water, a minor apology from someone who was busy entertaining. Yet even that tiny disruption drew laughter and sympathy away from me. I realized that the family's attentiveness and concern had been curated, and my exclusion was intentional, a subtle assertion of power. The understanding sparked a quiet fire in my chest, not of anger aimed at retaliation, but of focus on the moment when dignity would be reclaimed. I traced the worn wood of the countertop with my fingertips, thinking about the surfaces that had witnessed years of effort on my part. The countless meals prepared, the celebrations endured and enjoyed without notice. This space, though small and seemingly secondary, had been a stage for invisible labor. Today it would become a vantage point, a quiet headquarters from which I could observe, plan, and ultimately act. The betrayal had been administered with a smile, but it was finite, and I had time to respond on my terms. Minutes ticked by slowly, each one a pulse of reflection. I felt a rhythm of anticipation building, the subtle shift from humiliation to resolve. My eyes wandered over the kitchen's familiar objects. A coffee mug chipped at the rim, a towel frayed from decades of use, a small ornament from a long-past holiday. These details grounded me, reminded me that life persisted, and that my role in it was defined by neither the opinions nor the slights of others. I allowed a quiet pride to rise, knowing that the story had not ended with the command to sit in the kitchen. It had only begun. By the time the laughter and chatter in the dining room reached a crescendo, I felt steadier, more aligned with my own center. The anger had tempered into clarity, and the betrayal had sharpened my focus rather than fractured my spirit. I understood that the unfolding events would require patience, observation, and precise timing. The deed was ready, the moment would come, and the narrative was mine to direct. For now, I could wait, sit, and let the small indignities fuel a quiet determination that would carry me to the eventual restoration of dignity. Sitting in the kitchen, I felt the room shrink around me, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the indignation meant for me. The laughter from the dining room floated through the doorway, a casual, oblivious sound, unaware of the quiet storm it had stirred inside. I placed my hands on the edge of the counter, feeling the familiar grooves in the wood, and reminded myself that the day wasn't over. The command to remain in the kitchen had landed sharply, but it didn't have to define the entirety of the evening. I could still choose how this story would unfold. I poured myself another cup of tea, its warmth steadying my racing thoughts. The act of holding the cup, of tracing the handle with my thumb, gave me a small, tangible anchor in the chaos of exclusion. I thought about the room beyond, the place I had once sat with ease, now a space where my presence was optional at best, invisible at worst. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was calculated, almost polite. That politeness made it sting all the more, a subtle assertion of hierarchy that left me both insulted and oddly invigorated. My mind wandered to earlier years, to family gatherings when the children were still young. I recalled bustling around the kitchen, unnoticed yet indispensable, preparing the very meals that now surrounded me in scent but not in company. Those memories were bittersweet, reminding me of the quiet labor that had gone unseen and unacknowledged. Every roast carved, every ornament hung, every careful arrangement of chairs had been an unspoken testament to my devotion. Today, the acknowledgement I deserved was withheld, but I began to see that recognition, like respect, could be claimed rather than requested. I glanced at the deed tucked into my bag, hidden from sight but never far from thought. Its weight was symbolic, more than paper and ink. It represented the culmination of patience, foresight, and quiet preparation. I had considered every eventuality, anticipated the subtle shifts in family dynamics, and accounted for the ways entitlement might manifest. This evening, what had been a symbol of planning would become a vehicle for restoration. The thought offered a spark of calm resolve, turning the simmering frustration into a deliberate strategy. As I observed the kitchen space, I began to notice how it had always been a place of quiet command, even if unacknowledged. The worn countertop, the steady hum of the refrigerator, the neatly stacked dishes, all these elements spoke to a rhythm I had maintained for decades. Today, they were a vantage point, offering a hidden perspective on the larger scene unfolding beyond the doorway. The betrayal that had initially jarred me now felt like a lens, focusing attention and sharpening the contours of the confrontation yet to come. I thought about the interactions in the dining room, the way my son laughed, the way his wife glanced around the table, and the subtle exchanges that communicated hierarchy without words. The room was full of movement, but I felt a stillness growing within myself. That stillness was not resignation. It was clarity. I could observe without being consumed, plan without panicking, and wait for the moment when action would have the most impact. The initial sting of being sidelined was fading into a purposeful anticipation that settled deep in my chest. A small mishap in the dining room drew my attention. A glass tipped over, spilling a little water onto the tablecloth. The reaction was immediate, a flurry of napkins and apologies. Yet the attention that followed me from the doorway was non-existent. I realized then that my absence was noticed only in passing, a token recognition that highlighted the broader pattern of neglect. Rather than dwell on the insult, I let it deepen my resolve. I had spent a lifetime accommodating others, smoothing over mistakes, and maintaining harmony. Tonight, that history would inform a different choice, one where the equilibrium shifted in my favor. I caught myself smiling faintly at the thought. The smile was private, restrained, but it carried the satisfaction of someone who knows the narrative is no longer solely dictated by others. The deed, once a quiet object of planning, now seemed almost to pulse with possibility. Each moment that passed, each trivial incident in the dining room, was building toward a crescendo. I did not rush it. The power lay in the timing, in the precise alignment of expectation and revelation. My reflections turned to the years of small slights, the tiny omissions that accumulate into an emotional ledger. Invitations overlooked, opinions dismissed, contributions minimized. All of these instances had shaped the terrain of family interaction, carving patterns of entitlement and expectation. But in these patterns I now saw opportunity. The very assumptions that had isolated me would, if approached deliberately, magnify the impact of my forthcoming assertion. What had once felt like humiliation could become a demonstration of foresight, control, and dignity. I shifted my weight and leaned against the counter, taking a moment to breathe. The tea cup in my hand was warm against my fingers, grounding me in the present. I thought about the family as a whole, about each personality and habitual behavior, and considered how best to engage each without losing composure. Timing was everything. Too soon, and the gesture would seem petulant. Too late, and it might lose its sharpness. The balance required patience, observation, and a steady awareness of emotional currents, skills I had honed over decades of navigating family life. As I surveyed the kitchen, I noticed how the lighting softened the edges of the room, casting shadows that lent a quiet intimacy to the space. For the first time, I recognized that this marginal place, once associated with exclusion, could serve as a place of preparation and strategy. The isolation was temporary, the sense of being sidelined only a phase. What mattered now was how I would choose to act, how I would claim agency over my own narrative. The kitchen had shifted from a place of marginalization to a vantage point of empowerment. With every passing moment, my confidence deepened. The family's obliviousness, their casual hierarchy, their lack of awareness, these were no longer sources of pain. They were elements in a tableau I could now read and respond to. I began to map out the sequence of my intervention, imagining expressions of surprise, shifts in tone, and the subtle recalibration of attention that would accompany the reveal. Each scenario reinforced the clarity that had begun to take root in my chest. Dignity was something I could assert, even if it had been delayed for decades. Finally, as the clatter of cutlery and bursts of conversation continued from beyond the doorway, I allowed myself a small, measured smile. The moment of exclusion had introduced me to a new awareness, a quiet anticipation that stretched out before me like a rope I could climb. I would not be rushed. I would not be diminished. And when the time came, the act that I had prepared for months would unfold with precision, restoring not just respect but the understanding that my presence, patience, and foresight had value that no command or exclusion could erase. The chatter from the dining room seemed louder now, though it had not changed. Perhaps it was my own awareness sharpening, or maybe the contrast between their comfort and my sideline position made every sound more pronounced. I rested my elbows on the counter, tracing the familiar scratches and dents in the wood as if reading a map of past gatherings. Each mark reminded me of effort unseen, of meals prepared, dishes washed, and laughter tolerated without acknowledgement. I wondered why something as simple as a seat at the table had become a symbol of approval, a measure of belonging I suddenly craved. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth remind me that I was still present, still capable of action despite the marginalization. A memory surfaced, one Christmas, decades ago, when my own parents had insisted on setting boundaries that felt arbitrary but formative. I remembered the confusion and frustration, the sting of being guided away from the table despite my role in preparing the feast. That past humiliation was distant but instructive. It had shaped my patience, my understanding of timing, and the subtle mechanics of influence. Now, I could see that the same patience would be essential tonight. From the corner of my eye, I observed my son passing a plate to his wife, a small gesture that underscored the hierarchy already in place. The ease of their coordination was natural to them, but to me it highlighted the gulf that had opened between my place and theirs. I recognized the mix of resentment and calculation rising quietly inside me, a mental preparation for the moments when restraint would give way to deliberate action. The deed in my bag was a silent instrument, a pivot point I could introduce at the precise moment to shift perception and command attention. I remembered the small details of my preparation for this evening, the careful choice of what I would bring to the table, the manner in which I would move, and the calm resolve I had rehearsed in my mind. These were not mere precautions, they were deliberate steps toward reclaiming a sense of authority and dignity. The betrayal of exclusion had ignited a clarity I had not felt in years, a sense that the narrative could be altered if handled thoughtfully. The room beyond the kitchen had become a theater, and I had finally assumed a role behind the scenes with the power to shape the final act. A sudden noise in the dining room caught my attention, a chair scraping against the floor, a raised voice and laughter, and I felt the familiar surge of tension. My pulse quickened, not in panic but in anticipation. I allowed myself to watch, to study the interactions, noting who spoke, who listened, and who remained indifferent. Each gesture, each laugh, each glance was now a data point, informing the timing and precision with which I would execute the reveal. The slight movements of bodies and the rhythm of conversation formed a map I could navigate carefully. I reached for the bag containing the deed, feeling the reassuring thickness of the papers. It was more than legal documentation, it was a statement, a carefully constructed signal that my presence and contributions could not be ignored. I allowed my hand to rest on it for a moment, visualizing the moment when the tension would crystallize into recognition. There was a quiet satisfaction in imagining their surprise, in anticipating the subtle shift of power from omission to acknowledgement. For years, I had endured small slights, and now, I would convert them into a moment that demanded attention and respect. My thoughts drifted to past holidays and gatherings, where small, seemingly insignificant gestures had been overlooked. I remembered the way dishes I prepared were praised only in passing, the way advice offered with care was dismissed, the way my presence had been tolerated rather than celebrated. Each instance had been a lesson in patience, strategy, and emotional calibration. Tonight, all those lessons converged. I understood now that patience was not about submission. It was about timing, observation, and the ability to act decisively when the stakes were highest. I took another slow sip of tea, noticing how the warmth spread through my chest, grounding me in the moment. The smell of the roasted vegetables lingered, and I allowed myself a quiet survey of the kitchen, noting its familiar layout and the vantage points it provided. The place that had been a site of exclusion was now a strategic base, offering both concealment and oversight. From this position, I could monitor, plan, and eventually deliver the intervention I had prepared for months. The perceived powerlessness of being sidelined had been replaced by deliberate awareness. A sudden laugh from the dining room drew my attention to a minor mishap, a child spilling a bit of juice onto the tablecloth. The reaction was immediate, a flurry of napkins and apologies, but none of the energy was directed toward me. I realized that the patterns of neglect were predictable, and predictability could be leveraged. The family's casual oversight became a guide, a blueprint for how I would position myself and the deed for maximum effect. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, understanding that the evening's arc was entirely within reach if I maintained composure. I thought about the subtle tensions that had shaped my relationships over the years, the small resentments, the overlooked contributions, the minor but accumulated indignities. These were the quiet threads that formed the tapestry of familial dynamics, often invisible but powerful in their influence. By observing rather than reacting, I could navigate these threads and choose the moment when intervention would resonate most strongly. The deed, prepared in secret, was not just a document. It was a culmination of foresight, patience, and understanding of the emotional landscape. I leaned slightly against the counter, letting the warmth of the teacup steady my focus. I pictured the expressions I might see when the deed was revealed, the surprise, the hesitation, the recalibration of perception. I did not rush the moment. Timing was everything. The initial betrayal, the quiet command to sit in the kitchen, had set the stage perfectly. Now I waited, aware that the anticipation itself added weight to what was coming. The family's obliviousness would magnify the eventual impact, and the culmination of preparation and observation promised a moment of quiet triumph. As I observed the room beyond the doorway, I felt a mix of reflection and anticipation. The betrayal had been subtle, yet it had awakened a focus I had not experienced in years. Each movement, each word, each casual gesture in the dining room contributed to a narrative I was now equipped to guide. The kitchen, once a place of marginalization, had become my vantage point, my base of operations, and the site where dignity would be reclaimed. The stage was set, and I was ready to act when the moment demanded it. The muffled clink of silverware against plates echoed faintly through the doorway, a constant reminder of the space I was excluded from. Yet sitting there in the kitchen, I realized that the very act of being sidelined allowed me an unprecedented clarity. I could see patterns that others were too caught up in conversation and routine to notice. The subtle glances exchanged between my son and his wife, the way certain relatives leaned in to hear one another while ignoring the empty chair at the table. All of it painted a picture of hierarchy I had long observed but never fully leveraged. I traced the edge of the counter absent-mindedly, thinking about the many Christmases past. The room beyond had always been a place of celebration, warmth, and connection. Yet the underlying dynamics had quietly shifted over the years. Small acts of disregard, once shrugged off, had accumulated into a ledger of unspoken grievances. I remembered moments when my opinions were dismissed or overlooked, when decisions were made without consultation, and when acknowledgement came late or never at all. Tonight, those small slights had taken on an amplified significance. In that quiet space, I considered the deed tucked safely in my bag. It was no longer just a piece of paper but a representation of foresight and prudence, a tangible manifestation of years of quiet endurance. I imagined its potential to redirect attention, to force recognition, and to punctuate the subtle injustices that had shaped my role within this family. The thought did not fill me with malice but with a quiet, deliberate anticipation. I understood that the timing of its revelation would dictate the emotional impact, and I resolved to wait until the moment was precise. The laughter and chatter from the dining room rose in waves, occasionally punctuated by sharp bursts of conversation. Each sound reminded me of my absence from their immediate awareness, yet simultaneously highlighted the power I now held. I had learned, over decades of family gatherings, the rhythm of speech, the cadence of jokes, and the triggers that would elicit reaction. That understanding was now a tool rather than a burden, a way to shape the narrative quietly and without confrontation until the right instant. I thought back to the early years of raising my children, to the countless hours spent preparing meals, organizing celebrations, and smoothing over tensions. The kitchen, once a stage for unnoticed labor, had always been a place where control and foresight were quietly exercised. Tonight, that history gave me leverage. I could see the patterns of oversight as an advantage, a canvas on which the forthcoming intervention would make its mark. I let my eyes wander over the familiar countertop, imagining the gesture that would redirect the room's attention to me. A minor mishap in the dining room drew my attention. A child knocking over a cup and spilling juice. The response was immediate, a rush of napkins and apologies. Yet none of the energy included me. Observing the reaction, I felt a strange combination of vindication and amusement. These predictable moments were precisely the environment in which I could act decisively, turning expectation into impact. The deed, once a quiet instrument, would now serve as a lever to reestablish balance and assert the value of foresight and presence. I paused, reflecting on the dynamics that had evolved over the years. The subtle neglect, the habitual dismissal, and the casual assumptions about my role had all accumulated into a structure that favored oversight. But within that structure, I recognized a framework for strategic action. My exclusion had provided me perspective, and perspective offered power. With careful observation, patience, and timing, I could navigate the emotional terrain and produce an outcome that commanded respect without aggression. As I continued to watch the room, I noted small cues, the angle of a head, a lingering glance, the pattern of laughter that shifted depending on who spoke. Every detail was significant. In this quiet space, I could anticipate reactions, plan interventions, and preserve my composure. The sense of betrayal I had felt upon being told to remain in the kitchen had now transformed into focus and determination. I realized that the emotional charge of exclusion could be harnessed, transformed from frustration into strategy. I thought about the years spent managing expectations, mediating disputes, and quietly ensuring the smooth operation of family events. Those years had honed my awareness, patience, and understanding of human behavior. Now, these skills were more valuable than ever. The deed in my bag was symbolic but also practical, a culmination of foresight, planning, and years of observing patterns of entitlement and oversight. I knew that when the moment arrived, its presentation would shift perception instantly, transforming the evening's dynamics. Another memory surfaced, of a Christmas long ago when my contributions were overlooked, and acknowledgement came only after the fact. The sting had faded over time, but the lesson remained. Timing was everything. Anticipation increased the impact of revelation. Now, seated in the kitchen, I felt that the moment was approaching. The room beyond, with its laughter, chatter, and obliviousness, had become the perfect stage for a subtle but powerful assertion of recognition and respect. I set the cup of tea down and straightened my posture. My mind wandered briefly to the reactions I might expect. The slight pause, the sudden awareness, the recalibration of attention. These were predictable outcomes, informed by years of understanding how subtle shifts in behavior could amplify emotional impact. The betrayal of being sidelined had ignited this clarity, a perspective that allowed me to approach the moment with calm assurance rather than indignation. Finally, I allowed a quiet smile, restrained but purposeful, to cross my face. The kitchen, once a place of marginalization, had become my vantage point, a site of observation, strategy, and preparation. The moment of action, when I would present the deed, was still ahead, but I could already feel the power in restraint, patience, and awareness. I understood that this evening would be remembered not for conflict alone, but for the quiet assertion of presence and dignity that had been long overdue. The laughter from the dining room shifted subtly, a cadence of voices that I could almost read like a rhythm. I realized I had been holding my breath without knowing it, my fingers drumming lightly on the counter as my mind ran through every possible reaction they might have to my eventual intervention. Being sent to the kitchen had initially stung sharply, a reminder that my presence could be minimized, overlooked, or dismissed. Yet now, that exclusion had gifted me perspective, and perspective was the weapon I had learned to wield over decades of family dynamics. I glanced at the bag beside me, the edges of the deed peeking out, a promise of assertion and recognition waiting to be fulfilled. I thought about the moments that had led here, the subtle disrespect, the casual dismissals, the pattern of exclusion that had stretched back for years. Each slight had been a lesson in patience, in understanding timing, in observing without immediate reaction. It was remarkable how neglect, when viewed through a lens of strategy, could be transformed into a form of quiet empowerment. The room beyond the doorway hummed with activity. Plates clinked, chairs scraped, and laughter rose and fell like a tide. I watched my son speak to his spouse, his posture relaxed, unaware of the gravity I carried in my bag. That weight was not anger. It was preparation, reflection, and deliberate anticipation. I had learned that control was not about shouting louder but about choosing the precise moment to shift attention and demand acknowledgement. In that kitchen, I felt more potent than I had in years. A memory came unbidden. Another Christmas, when I had orchestrated the meal, ensured every detail was perfect, only to have my efforts lightly acknowledged, if at all. The sting of being overlooked then had been absorbed into a larger pattern of endurance, teaching me that influence often worked best when subtle and patient. That lesson resonated now, as I watched the family in their effortless comfort, oblivious to the significance of my silent presence. The irony was not lost on me. The very act of being excluded had provided the vantage point necessary to reclaim my authority. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the kitchen wrap around me. The aroma of roasted vegetables and spices wafted faintly through the open doorway, mingling with the sounds of laughter. It was almost poetic how sensory memories of past gatherings intertwined with the anticipation of what was to come. I recalled the countless hours of preparation I had invested over the years, the precision of timing, and the careful attention to detail. That same care would now guide the introduction of the deed, transforming a private act of preparation into a public moment of recognition. I allowed my eyes to wander to the family portraits lining the wall, images of holidays past and moments long forgotten. There was a quiet weight in seeing generations depicted there. Some present, some absent, each a reminder of the patterns that had shaped our relationships. I thought of how small acts of disregard, unnoticed gestures, and overlooked contributions had accumulated over decades, creating an emotional ledger that had gone largely unacknowledged. Tonight, that ledger would be settled, quietly but unmistakably, through timing, observation, and deliberate action. A child's sudden question echoed from the dining room, breaking through my train of thought. The casual nature of the interruption reminded me how oblivious they were to my quiet observation. I allowed a small, controlled smile to cross my face, appreciating that predictability could now be harnessed. The rhythm of conversation, the ebb and flow of attention, and the subtle cues of behavior were all tools in my hands. The kitchen, once a place of sidelining, had become a strategic observatory from which I could direct the evening's emotional arc. I reached for the deed, feeling its weight and the thickness of the papers within. The significance of the document extended far beyond its legal function. It was a symbol, a statement, a carefully calculated assertion of presence and authority. I ran my fingers over its surface, rehearsing the timing of when it would emerge, when attention would pivot, and when the narrative of neglect would be confronted without confrontation. In that moment, I realized the power inherent in patience and preparation. My thoughts returned briefly to past holidays, to moments of unacknowledged work and subtle slights that had built over time. I remembered the careful measures I had taken to smooth tensions, to maintain harmony, and to ensure the comfort of others. Those acts had taught me that influence was often quiet, measured, and strategic. Now, the culmination of all those years of quiet work, careful observation, and emotional calibration was about to manifest in a single act that would reset the family dynamic. The chatter continued, punctuated by laughter and the occasional raised voice. I noted the subtle cues of hierarchy, the way certain voices dominated, the positioning of bodies, and the attention given to specific individuals. Every movement, every glance, every small gesture was an opportunity to anticipate reaction, to calculate impact, and to act with precision. The exclusion I had initially felt was now reframed as a vantage point, a place from which strategy and foresight could prevail. I paused, letting my gaze drift to the window and the snow settling outside. The quiet contrast between the calm exterior and the subtle chaos inside mirrored my own state, poised, observant, and ready to act. The kitchen had transformed from a place of sidelining to a command center, offering both concealment and strategic oversight. I felt a quiet thrill at the thought that the family's obliviousness would amplify the eventual impact of the deed's presentation. Timing, patience, and awareness had converged to create an opportunity for recognition and dignity. With a deliberate breath, I centered myself, feeling the warmth of tea and the weight of anticipation settle together. The room beyond remained unaware of the power shift quietly forming within the kitchen. I could see the gestures, hear the conversations, and anticipate reactions, all while maintaining composure. The moment of revelation was still ahead, but each passing second reinforced the potency of restraint, observation, and strategic action. The kitchen, once a place of marginalization, was now a position of empowerment. I allowed a final, quiet smile to cross my face, acknowledging that the act ahead was not about confrontation or malice, but about recognition and balance. The patterns of oversight and casual neglect had been carefully observed and would now be addressed. The deed, ready in my bag, represented both foresight and quiet assertion. Tonight, dignity would be restored, acknowledgement earned, and the narrative subtly but undeniably reshaped. The stage was set, the audience unaware, and the moment approaching. The sound of laughter carried from the dining room, a rhythmic reminder that life inside the house continued oblivious to the tension that had taken root in the kitchen. I remained by the counter, fingers wrapped loosely around the bag holding the deed, feeling a mix of calm and anticipation. The exclusion I had endured earlier now seemed almost tactical in hindsight. It had offered a quiet space for observation, reflection, and preparation. I considered how easily the atmosphere could have turned chaotic if I had acted impulsively, but restraint had taught me that timing, more than volume, would command attention. As I watched through the doorway, I recalled the long line of holidays past, each with its minor slights and quiet dismissals. I remembered carefully folding napkins while being ignored, arranging dishes with precision while my efforts went unrecognized. The repetition of small gestures, over years, had become a silent ledger of unacknowledged care. It was strange, almost poetic, how the very acts meant to create joy could later serve as a reminder of invisibility. Yet, invisibility had offered a vantage point, allowing me to chart the room's dynamics and anticipate responses. The conversation at the table shifted to casual memories, laughter punctuating the recounting of old stories. I recognized the subtle power in observation, noting who laughed first, whose attention drifted, and who dominated the floor. Each gesture, each fleeting glance, became data in my mind, shaping how I would introduce the deed at the appropriate moment. Strategy, I realized, was as much about silence as speech, and patience often magnified impact. Being unseen in the kitchen had granted me a position of authority I had never wielded before, not through confrontation, but through deliberate, almost invisible positioning. I sipped my tea slowly, letting the warmth remind me that the night's unfolding would be measured, not rushed. Memories surfaced of my own parents and their quiet ways of asserting authority, lessons I had unconsciously absorbed and later applied in subtle ways throughout my adult life. Those lessons now converged into a single, potent act. The deed was more than a piece of paper. It was a symbol of recognition, of dignity reclaimed, and of authority carefully calibrated through years of observation and strategic patience. A clatter of silverware drew my attention to the youngest cousin spilling juice on the table. The brief moment of chaos allowed me to notice subtle shifts. How my son's spouse instinctively reached to calm the child, how eyes darted toward the room's center, and how everyone unconsciously reasserted their positions within the household hierarchy. I realized that family dynamics were like currents, invisible to most but traceable to those patient enough to observe. I had spent years reading these currents, and tonight, the deed would become a visible marker in that flow, forcing acknowledgement of patterns that had long gone unnoticed. The aromas of roasted meat and spiced desserts drifted into the kitchen, grounding me in the sensory reality of the evening. The warmth, the chatter, and even the occasional disagreement were all elements of the environment I had grown accustomed to analyzing. There was a rhythm to this household, one I could now manipulate subtly through timing. My exclusion had been an unintentional advantage, turning what felt like rejection into a platform for strategic action. I realized that the kitchen, once a place of sidelining, had become a command center, offering both concealment and clarity. A memory of last year's Christmas passed through my mind. A year when tensions flared over trivial disagreements, and my attempts to mediate had gone unnoticed. That lesson lingered in me tonight. Influence was more potent when earned silently, observed carefully, and enacted deliberately. The deed in my bag carried the culmination of that insight. When the moment arrived, it would not be a spectacle of anger, but a measured revelation that reshaped awareness and commanded respect. I considered the pattern of small grievances that had accumulated over decades, gently ignored requests, subtle dismissals, and the occasional outright contradiction. Each had been absorbed without reaction, catalogued internally, and transformed into an understanding of family rhythm. Tonight, I would translate years of observation into a single act of assertion. The deed represented more than legality. It was acknowledgement of effort, patience, and quiet authority. It was time to act, yet act with calculated precision rather than impulsive emotion. Watching my son laugh at a story told by his spouse, I noted the ease with which he assumed command of attention. It reminded me that recognition was often won through spectacle. But tonight, spectacle would not be needed. The act of presenting the deed, timed correctly, would shift attention without the need for shouting or confrontation. The patterns I had studied, the subtle gestures catalogued, would ensure impact. My exclusion had inadvertently taught me patience and strategic observation, the quiet tools of influence I would wield with confidence. I straightened my posture slightly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease as I reminded myself of the evening's objective. The deed's presentation would be deliberate, measured, and unmistakable in its significance. I visualized the moment, the initial confusion, the shift in attention, the eventual acknowledgement that my presence, though long sidelined, could not be ignored. The kitchen, previously a place of marginalization, had become a vantage point from which dignity and authority could be quietly reclaimed. The flicker of candlelight on the counter reminded me of past holidays, the faint scent of pine mingling with the warmth of the kitchen. I reflected on the emotional labor that had gone into family gatherings over the years. Carefully prepared meals, orchestrated conversations, and the invisible work of maintaining harmony. Tonight, that labor would find tangible recognition, not through overt confrontation, but through the quiet, inevitable revelation of effort and preparation. The deed in my bag represented the culmination of years of patience and observation. I heard a murmur of conversation, laughter rising and falling like waves. My son made a joke, his spouse laughed, and a cousin chimed in with a memory of a past holiday. I noted each reaction, each shift of attention, cataloging the emotional landscape. The patterns were clear, and the time for subtle intervention was approaching. I allowed a small, satisfied smile, understanding that the impact of the deed would not come from confrontation but from precision, timing, and the quiet accumulation of authority through years of strategic patience. Finally, I stood straighter, feeling the bag's weight as a reminder of the moment's significance. The family remained unaware of the approaching pivot, absorbed in conversation and tradition. The deed, simple in form but powerful in implication, awaited its moment. Tonight, dignity would be quietly asserted, patterns acknowledged, and the subtle power of patience and observation revealed. The kitchen had transformed from a place of exclusion to the stage for quiet authority, and the moment of recognition was imminent. The clatter of silverware slowed, a subtle pause in the room that felt almost like an unconscious holding of breath. I could sense the shift in energy even before anyone spoke, as if the house itself anticipated a change. Standing in the kitchen doorway, I gripped the bag holding the deed more firmly, feeling the quiet weight of years of patience and observation pressing against my hands. Each conversation, each joke, each story told at the table had become part of a tapestry I had been weaving in my mind for decades. The moment to act was approaching, yet I could still linger in the silence, savoring the subtle power of anticipation. I recalled my own childhood holidays, memories of sitting at the edge of the table, watching family rituals unfold, aware yet unseen. I remembered the sting of being overlooked, the quiet longing to be acknowledged, and how those early experiences had shaped my sense of timing and restraint. Now, decades later, the roles had reversed. I had learned to read subtle cues, to understand the hierarchy of attention, and to recognize the exact moment when influence could be quietly asserted. The deed in my bag was more than legal documentation. It was the culmination of those lessons, a tangible symbol of authority I had never wielded before in such a precise, deliberate manner. As I adjusted the hem of my sweater, I noted the laughter rippling across the table, the easy gestures of comfort, the casual dominance of certain voices over others. Observation had become my instrument of control, and I understood the psychology of each family member, who craved approval, who thrived on attention, who could be unsettled with subtle disruption. The deed would serve as a gentle earthquake, shifting the room's equilibrium without the need for confrontation. I allowed myself a small, private smile, knowing that my careful patience and acute awareness had brought me to this moment. Memories of past slights surfaced, words ignored, opinions dismissed, gestures overlooked, but instead of anger, they now fueled clarity. I had spent decades learning the rhythm of my family, noting patterns of avoidance, subtle power plays, and unspoken hierarchies. Tonight, the kitchen, once a space of marginalization, had become a vantage point from which I could orchestrate recognition without aggression. Every laugh, every movement, every conversation at the table fed my understanding of when and how to introduce the deed. I realized that observation, more than speech, often commands the most profound attention. I remembered last year's holiday gathering, when a minor misunderstanding escalated into a confrontation. My attempts at diplomacy had failed because timing was off and the emotional currents were misread. Tonight, I was different. Years of reflection and experience had sharpened my perception. I could see how tension and humor, pride and humility, all coexisted in a delicate balance. I waited for the precise point when the revelation of the deed would command notice, turning years of quiet endurance into immediate acknowledgement. The aroma of roasted turkey and fresh pine mingled in the air, and I felt the gentle tug of nostalgia against the edge of my focus. Holidays were always sensory experiences as well as emotional, and tonight was no exception. The warmth, the smells, and the familiar chatter created a setting that seemed mundane, yet each element contributed to the timing and impact of what I was about to do. My own presence, once relegated to the periphery, now felt charged with possibility. The kitchen was my observatory, and the deed would soon become the lens through which attention and recognition focused on me. I thought about the various family members' reactions over the years, the subtle dismissals, the unintended slights, the small victories quietly celebrated by others. Each had been catalogued in my mind, an internal ledger of interactions that shaped the way I would act tonight. My son's gestures of casual dominance, my spouse's gentle but firm interventions, the children's laughter and curiosity, all these were variables I had accounted for. My strategy was not impulsive. It was the product of decades of understanding and observation, culminating in a deliberate act that would realign recognition and authority within the family unit. As I observed a cousin retelling an old anecdote, I felt a quiet thrill at the anticipation of the deed's unveiling. I imagined the pause, the subtle shift in attention, the moment when all the careful observation and silent patience would crystallize into acknowledgement. I realized that influence often comes not from aggression or demand, but from precision and timing. The deed was the instrument, and the room was the canvas, waiting for the brushstroke that would finally make the invisible visible. I reflected on my own emotional journey. The small humiliations absorbed, the patience cultivated, the quiet strategic awareness developed over years of careful observation. Each memory reinforced the value of measured action. The deed, in my hands, was a distillation of experience, emotion, and timing. It was not merely a legal document, but a vessel carrying decades of silent authority and calculated insight. The upcoming moment was more than an act. It was an assertion of presence, patience, and enduring influence. I noted the room again. The way certain eyes lingered longer on familiar faces, the way hands gestured as stories unfolded, the subtle tensions beneath the surface. Each detail mattered. Each nuance contributed to the environment I had learned to navigate so carefully. The deed would not be presented with fanfare, but with quiet precision that ensured its significance could not be ignored. Observation had taught me the power of subtlety, and tonight subtlety would become unmistakable impact. The children's laughter broke through another story, and I allowed a small, inward smile, savoring the last moments of unnoticed positioning. Soon, the deed would shift attention, transforming the dynamics carefully observed over decades. The kitchen had been a place of marginalization, but now it was my strategic vantage point, offering both concealment and clarity. I had learned that true influence does not announce itself prematurely. It waits, accumulates, and arrives with timing that demands acknowledgement. I remembered a conversation from years ago with a close friend about the quiet strategies of influence and how observation often yields more power than confrontation. That lesson resonated fully tonight. The deed, the timing, the observant patience, all combined to form a moment of inevitable recognition. The family remained unaware, absorbed in conversation, but the subtle currents had shifted, and I could feel the impending transformation. Finally, I adjusted my stance, feeling the solid weight of the bag and the anticipation it carried. I understood that patience had created this moment, observation had shaped it, and now action would crystallize the years of quiet strategy into visible acknowledgement. The kitchen, once a space of exclusion, had become the command center for a carefully orchestrated assertion of dignity and authority. The deed awaited its reveal, and the impact was imminent. I lingered a moment longer in the kitchen, letting the ambient noise of conversation wash over me. Each laugh, each raised glass, each clink of cutlery became part of the prelude to what was about to happen. The house felt alive, yet I sensed the underlying currents of entitlement and expectation threading through the room. My presence here, unseen yet observant, gave me a vantage point that carried more weight than any spoken words. The deed in my hand was not merely paper. It was a culmination of careful foresight, the physical manifestation of years of patience and quiet understanding. I recalled a memory from another Christmas years ago, one that had been tinged with exclusion and quiet disappointment. I had been seated at the edge of the table, overlooked while conversations swirled around me. The slight had stung, not because it was intentional, but because it revealed how easily my voice could be dismissed. That memory lingered tonight, lending gravity to the decision I had made to act in a controlled, deliberate way. I was no longer the quiet observer on the margins. I had prepared, and the moment to assert recognition had arrived. Stepping closer to the doorway that led into the main dining room, I allowed myself to observe the interactions at the table more sharply. The subtle ways my family members maneuvered for attention, the little nods and interruptions, the unspoken hierarchies. All of it became an internal map guiding the timing of my approach. The deed's impact would depend on precision, not aggression. I understood that influence often comes quietly, born of observation and timing rather than confrontation. Each person's behavior gave me insight into how to ensure acknowledgement without igniting unnecessary conflict. My thoughts drifted to past attempts at asserting presence. Holiday dinners where words had fallen flat, small gestures ignored, or polite corrections brushed aside. Each failure had been a lesson in understanding family dynamics, in calibrating patience, in discerning the exact moment when intervention would resonate. Now, as I stood just beyond the threshold, I felt the steady confidence that comes with experience and careful planning. The deed was a tool, but the real power lay in the awareness and judgment that had prepared me to use it effectively. I noticed subtle tensions forming around the table. A cousin's voice had softened unexpectedly, perhaps in anticipation of a story being told or a point being made. My son laughed at something trivial, his pride momentarily taking precedence over subtle attentiveness. Every minor shift became part of the equation, each micro-behavior informing the precise moment to step forward. Timing, more than volume, would carry the authority I intended to establish. I realized that all these years of observation were leading to this single intersection of attention, patience, and subtle disruption. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the cool, calculated focus I brought with me. I moved with quiet confidence, allowing the holiday ambience to act as camouflage for my intent. The deed was safely hidden, a promise of revelation yet to unfold. My mind catalogued everything. Who would be unsettled, who might laugh nervously, who would look away in discomfort. Anticipation was a tool, and I could feel it threading through the room even before the deed emerged. The kitchen had transformed into a command post, a place from which the quiet orchestration of attention could begin. I thought about my spouse, whose gentle guidance had long balanced my tendencies toward patience and observation. They had always reminded me that timing and awareness could achieve far more than confrontation. Their voice, calm and deliberate, echoed in my mind as I considered the impending moment. Every word, every gesture, every glance around the table had been carefully mapped in my mind, creating a landscape that was ready for the subtle shock of recognition the deed would provide. Memories of small injustices resurfaced, an opinion dismissed, a gesture ignored, a polite correction met with indifference. Rather than fueling resentment, these memories now reinforced the importance of the moment. I had learned that quiet strategy, honed over decades, can yield profound acknowledgement when wielded with awareness and patience. The deed's eventual presentation would be the culmination of this internal work, transforming years of quiet observation into immediate visibility. As I moved closer, the laughter and chatter began to feel like a tide against which the deed's arrival would stand out sharply. I could imagine the micro-reactions already. The pause, the sideways glance, the slight tightening of shoulders. Subtlety, I knew, would magnify the impact. I breathed in deeply, savoring the faint aroma of roasted turkey, candle wax, and pine, each familiar detail anchoring me while simultaneously heightening the contrast between mundane warmth and the quiet assertion of authority I was about to make. I reflected on the psychological dimensions of my family dynamics. Years of watching patterns, noting micro-reactions, and observing who commanded attention at which moments had built a mental map of influence. The deed was not merely a legal document. It was the key to rewriting recognition, shifting the subtle hierarchy of acknowledgement at the table. Each movement, each pause, each gesture had been anticipated, leaving only the precise moment to introduce the document and ensure that it could not be ignored. The room hummed with familial energy, yet I felt the edges of tension under the surface. I recognized that disruption, when timed precisely, could illuminate patterns of power and attention in ways words alone could not. I adjusted the bag in my hands, feeling its weight as both a literal and figurative instrument. This was a moment in which preparation, patience, and subtle assertion would converge, allowing me to command recognition quietly but unmistakably. Finally, I positioned myself just outside the flow of conversation, close enough to move forward yet still observing the room's rhythm. Every detail mattered: the placement of chairs, the tilt of heads, the angle of light on the polished table. The deed was more than paper. It was a signal, a culmination of decades of understanding and restraint. Soon, its presentation would punctuate the room with clarity, turning observation into acknowledgement. I finally stepped into the dining room, feeling the familiar warmth of the room, yet aware that tonight, warmth would not dictate attention. The chatter was a steady hum, punctuated by laughter and clinking cutlery. I carried the deed with a quiet steadiness, my hands firm but calm. Every smile, every casual exchange, seemed to underscore the subtle hierarchy I had endured for years. For a moment, I let myself simply observe, noticing the micro-expressions, the way people leaned into conversations, the fleeting exchanges that revealed alliances, preferences, and, most importantly, where my presence had been underestimated. My son's laughter rang louder than usual, a sign of confidence, or perhaps arrogance, that had grown over the years. I remembered earlier Christmases where he had taken control of conversation, claiming territory in ways subtle and overt. Back then, I had tried to assert myself verbally, only to be brushed aside. That pattern, repeated over decades, had taught me the quiet power of patience, observation, and, when necessary, delayed action. The deed in my hands was not a weapon. It was a precise instrument, designed to assert recognition without overt confrontation. As I approached the table, the room's warmth felt almost suffocating, a sharp contrast to the careful calculation that had carried me here. I could feel the anticipation building in my chest, not from excitement, but from the understanding that every small movement around me mattered. The slight shift of my daughter-in-law's eyes toward the kitchen, the subtle pause in my son's conversation, the quiet attention of a cousin who always noticed what others ignored. These details were the markers that the moment for action was near. Timing, more than volume, would determine the impact. I took a deliberate step forward, and the deed finally came into view, concealed in my coat pocket. Its weight was tangible, but it carried more than authority. It held years of careful foresight, late nights of planning, and quiet anticipation of the exact moment when its significance would resonate. I recalled a Christmas long ago, when a similarly small, overlooked gesture had gone unnoticed, leaving a sting that lingered for months. Tonight, that pattern would be reversed. Recognition would come, and it would come on my terms, with subtlety and clarity. The conversation at the table swirled, casual in tone yet charged in undercurrents. I could sense the shifting glances, the small adjustments in posture, the sudden attentiveness as someone caught sight of my movement. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of presence, a ripple that made the room slightly off-kilter. I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction. This was the culmination of careful observation and patience. The deed would soon transform these ripples into waves of acknowledgement that could no longer be ignored. I thought of my spouse's voice again, reminding me that timing and awareness often achieve far more than confrontation or argument. Their words had been a steady anchor, guiding me toward a method of engagement that relied on subtle assertion rather than overt dominance. Every past failure, every moment of being overlooked had shaped the strategy. The deed would not only be a revelation but also a demonstration of patience rewarded, foresight honored, and dignity reclaimed. As I reached the head of the table, I paused, letting the ambient noise act as a brief camouflage for the gesture I was about to make. The room's rhythm created a natural lead-in, the cadence of laughter and conversation marking the space where my presence would finally demand acknowledgement. I slid the deed from my pocket and allowed it to rest lightly on the edge of the table, just enough to catch attention without drawing immediate confrontation. Every eye flickered toward it. Every pause, every blink, became a marker of the subtle disruption I had orchestrated. The micro-reactions were instantaneous. My son's face froze for a fraction of a second before curiosity overtook indignation. The daughter-in-law's eyes widened slightly, and I could see a cousin stiffen as they realized something significant had shifted in the room's energy. I remained calm, observing these ripples, noting how quiet assertion could command authority without a raised voice. The deed was no longer just paper. It had become a signal, a pivot upon which recognition and respect could rotate, subtle yet undeniable. I recalled moments when words had failed me, when polite reminders had been brushed aside. Tonight, the deed was my silent voice, and its impact would not rely on argument or confrontation. The room's attention had subtly shifted, drawn by the presence of this single object that embodied foresight, patience, and recognition. In that shift, I could feel the invisible hierarchy bending, realigning in a way that acknowledged my long-overlooked place in the family dynamic. Each passing moment reinforced the quiet power of preparation and timing. I allowed the room to absorb the gesture, letting silence amplify its significance. The deed's presentation, subtle yet deliberate, became a mirror reflecting every slight, every dismissal, every overlooked opinion from years past. Now, the acknowledgement would be unavoidable, earned through patience and foresight rather than demand. I watched closely as my son finally looked directly at me, recognition dawning, mingled with surprise. The daughter-in-law, who had orchestrated the earlier slight by seating me in the kitchen, seemed momentarily disarmed, her prior control over perception disrupted. I allowed a quiet pause, savoring the tension, knowing that patience and observation had created this precise impact. The deed, small and unassuming in appearance, carried the weight of decades of careful strategy and understanding of human behavior. Even the casual observer could sense the shift. Conversations slowed. Subtle glances were exchanged. I knew that this moment, which I had cultivated for years, would linger in memory, not through argument or confrontation, but through quiet assertion and careful timing. The deed had become both symbol and instrument, quietly realigning attention, acknowledgement, and respect in a room that had long overlooked my presence. The room seemed to pause, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The deed lay between us, an unassuming rectangle of paper that carried more authority than any words I could have spoken. I could feel the subtle shift in energy, the recognition that my presence and foresight had quietly reclaimed a place long denied. My son's eyes searched mine, trying to gauge the intent, and for the first time in years, I sensed hesitation where there had once been certainty. It was not anger that held him still, but the dawning realization that control was no longer unilateral. I recalled the countless Christmas dinners past, where I had been relegated to the background, my opinions dismissed, my presence taken for granted. Each slight had accumulated, subtle but piercing, leaving quiet scars that time alone could not heal. I remembered smiling through conversations where my voice was unheard, laughter that excluded me, and the invisible rules that relegated me to the edges. Tonight, however, the dynamics were reversed, not with force or confrontation, but with careful orchestration, a subtle reclamation of acknowledgement and respect. I watched as my daughter-in-law's expression shifted. Her earlier confidence, the ease with which she had seated me in the kitchen, began to falter. There was a flicker of surprise, a hint of uncertainty that she hadn't anticipated. I had expected resistance, perhaps even confrontation, but the deed's quiet presence carried a weight that words alone could not achieve. It demanded attention, commanded recognition, and imposed reflection. The room, once comfortably arranged around her authority, had subtly recentered itself, highlighting the shift in influence without a single raised voice. My son shifted slightly in his chair, the familiar ease replaced by caution. I could sense the mental calculation unfolding behind his eyes, the attempt to reconcile years of assumed dominance with this unexpected assertion. The quiet strategy one had employed, learned through decades of patient observation, was revealing its power. It was not a lesson shouted, but one experienced in real time, subtle yet undeniable, leaving space for realization rather than argument. I recalled how my spouse had often reminded me that dignity is reclaimed not through force but through deliberate, thoughtful action. The deed, carefully prepared and timed, embodied this principle. It was a quiet assertion of presence, a tangible reminder that oversight and disrespect carry consequences, even when delivered without anger or theatrics. I allowed myself a moment to absorb the scene, noting how subtlety and foresight often achieve more than overt confrontation ever could. The murmurs around the table grew quieter, fragmented, as individuals processed the implications. Every glance, every pause, became part of an unspoken dialogue. I noticed my niece, who had often overlooked my presence in casual gatherings, now leaning forward slightly, her attention caught by the shift in tone. My presence, once background noise, now carried significance. The deed had created a quiet tension, a space where acknowledgement and reflection coexisted, forcing each person to reconsider the narratives they had comfortably relied upon. I remembered the small moments that had led to this night. Discussions brushed aside, casual slights that felt inconsequential at the time, and the quiet accumulation of oversight that had eroded my sense of belonging. Each memory added weight to the current scene, reminding me that patience and strategic timing often carry more impact than direct confrontation. The deed was the culmination of those experiences, a symbol of foresight and careful planning that transformed years of quiet endurance into a single moment of recognition. As the minutes stretched, I observed my son's hands. He fiddled with his fork, a subtle gesture betraying the uncertainty that had crept in. It was a reminder that influence, once assumed, is fragile when met with calculated resolve. The shift was not immediate, not explosive, but deliberate and sustained. I could feel the satisfaction of seeing patience and preparation validated in real time, the quiet joy of witnessing acknowledgement arrive without the need for dramatics. I let my gaze sweep the table, noting the reactions of each family member. The daughter-in-law, the cousin, the aunt. They were all subtly adjusting, processing the quiet power of this small but significant intervention. It was as if the room had collectively recognized that dynamics had changed, that my role could no longer be diminished, and that years of unacknowledged effort and insight now commanded a quiet respect. This was not about revenge or humiliation. It was about establishing a balance that had long been absent. The act of placing the deed on the table was simple, yet its ramifications were profound. I felt the room's focus shift, attention directed toward me not out of fear, but recognition. The silent authority carried by the deed had transformed an ordinary Christmas dinner into a turning point. A subtle reclamation of dignity, a moment where foresight and preparation asserted themselves over assumption and entitlement. I could feel the tension lingering, delicate but undeniable, marking the first instance in years where my presence commanded consideration rather than being ignored. I reflected on the lessons embedded in this moment. Recognition, respect, and dignity are not always granted. They are often cultivated, patiently and deliberately, through observation, timing, and quiet action. The deed had done more than assert ownership. It had crystallized years of insight, endurance, and strategic patience. Each reaction at the table reinforced this truth, from hesitation to curiosity, from surprise to acknowledgement. This night was not about confrontation but validation. A subtle yet powerful demonstration of the enduring value of careful planning and quiet authority. Finally, I allowed myself a measured breath, observing the subtle relaxation of tension as each person began to process what had occurred. The room had shifted, rebalanced, and in that quiet recalibration, I recognized the power of patience, insight, and foresight. The deed remained on the table, unassuming but potent, a symbol not only of my role within the family but of the respect that could be claimed without overt conflict. In that moment, I understood that influence often arrives silently, its impact measured not in volume, but in the depth of acknowledgement it commands. The room had grown quiet, each clink of cutlery echoing against the walls as if emphasizing the weight of the moment. The deed sat between us, unassuming yet unmistakably potent. I could feel the subtle shifts in posture, the slight lean forward of those who had previously ignored me, and the uneasy glances exchanged as they tried to process the significance of what had just occurred. There was a new awareness in the air, one that wasn't forced but emerged organically from a carefully orchestrated revelation. The tension had not dissipated. It had transformed, becoming charged with recognition, hesitation, and the beginnings of reflection. I recalled the previous Christmases, where I had been gently nudged aside, the laughter and chatter orbiting around me while my presence was virtually invisible. The relegation to the kitchen was not merely a spatial choice. It was symbolic of the subtle hierarchy that had long defined our family dynamics. I had smiled politely, laughed at jokes that weren't meant for me, and nodded along to discussions where my opinions were neither sought nor valued. Yet, behind that outward composure, I had catalogued every slight, every overlooked suggestion, every quiet dismissal, knowing that patience and careful planning often yield a far more powerful response than immediate confrontation. Watching my son now, I could see the mental calculus behind his expression. The confidence he had always displayed was tempered with uncertainty, a hesitancy born from realizing that his assumptions of control were no longer unchallenged. The deed had done more than assert legal authority. It had recalibrated the invisible balance of respect at the table. It was a quiet, calculated assertion, a methodical demonstration that years of oversight and subtle disregard had consequences, even when delivered without anger. I allowed myself to observe, Noting how the shift was as much psychological as it was material, the impact resonating in the minds of each person present. My daughter-in-law's gaze lingered on the deed, her expression a mixture of shock, frustration, and perhaps the first flicker of recognition that her assumed dominance was being questioned. The ease with which she had seated me in the kitchen moments ago now felt like an illusion, a temporary control that evaporated under the weight of preparation and foresight. There was no raised voice, no dramatic confrontation, just the undeniable presence of authority manifest in the careful placement of a single object. I realized then that influence often speaks loudest in its silence, and recognition can be far more potent when it is discovered rather than demanded. The murmurs around the table began to stir, subtle at first and then more pronounced, as those who had previously underestimated me started to process the implications. I could sense my niece leaning forward slightly, her curiosity piqued by the unexpected turn of events. The dynamics of previous gatherings, where her attention had bypassed me entirely, were now subtly altered. The deed had shifted the narrative, turning the quiet endurance of years into a tangible moment of authority. It was a reminder that preparation, patience, and insight often achieve what confrontation cannot. Memories surfaced, the accumulation of small injustices that had led to this night. I recalled conversations brushed aside, suggestions ignored, and moments when my presence had been subtly minimized. Each memory was a reminder of the necessity of strategy, of quietly observing before acting. The deed was the manifestation of that strategy, a symbol of both foresight and endurance, carrying a weight that words alone could not achieve. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not from victory over my family, but from the realization that dignity could be reclaimed without the need for drama or confrontation. As I observed my son, I noticed his subtle shifts in posture, the micro-expressions betraying his attempts to maintain composure while grappling with the unexpected assertion of authority. The deed had created a pause, a moment of reflection where assumptions were questioned and roles recalibrated. It was not an immediate resolution, but the beginning of a transformation in awareness, a subtle realignment that emphasized respect over entitlement. I allowed myself to remain quiet, understanding that silence often amplifies impact more than words ever could. I could see the ripple effects on other family members. The cousin who often ignored me now seemed more attentive. The aunt who had dismissed my input previously leaned slightly forward, and even the niece, previously absorbed in her own world, now observed with a careful curiosity. The deed had done more than assert legal authority. It had created a pause in the usual rhythm of interactions, a space for reflection and acknowledgement. Each subtle shift in attention was a testament to the power of preparation, foresight, and strategic patience. Reflecting on my own feelings, I realized the importance of maintaining composure amidst subtle upheaval. There was no rush to assert dominance or demand recognition. The mere presence of the deed was enough to realign dynamics and prompt introspection. This quiet authority, grounded in careful planning and deliberate action, was far more satisfying than any immediate confrontation. I allowed myself a moment to absorb the scene, noting how the unspoken acknowledgement carried more weight than any verbal declaration could have achieved. I thought about the broader lesson embedded in this moment. Patience, observation, and strategic action often achieve results that direct confrontation cannot. The deed symbolized more than ownership. It represented the culmination of years of experience, insight, and subtle endurance. It was a quiet yet powerful assertion of dignity, a reminder that respect is earned, not granted, and that recognition often arrives in unexpected, understated ways. I felt a renewed sense of confidence, knowing that the dynamics at this table had been gently, irrevocably shifted. The final minutes of the meal unfolded with subtle changes in behavior. Conversations now included me naturally. Attention no longer bypassed my presence, and the quiet respect established by the deed lingered in each glance and gesture. The shift was neither dramatic nor loud, but deliberate, noticeable, and enduring. I felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing the long-term planning validated, a subtle triumph rooted in patience, observation, and thoughtful action. As the evening wore on, the room's energy subtly evolved. The deed remained at the center of attention, a silent but unmistakable anchor for the recalibrated respect. I could see my son's attempts to regain certainty tempered by careful observation of the room's new dynamics. Each family member seemed to process the evening differently, but the underlying current of acknowledgement was unmistakable. The quiet assertion of authority, delivered without confrontation, had shifted the emotional landscape of the gathering. By the time dessert was served, I sensed a fragile equilibrium settling over the table. The deed had done more than assert control. It had instigated reflection, prompted acknowledgement, and established a subtle, enduring shift in the family dynamic. I felt the satisfaction of seeing strategic patience validated in real time, the quiet joy of witnessing recognition achieved without drama, and the knowledge that dignity had been reclaimed in the most understated yet powerful way. Even as the plates were cleared, the echoes of the earlier tension lingered in the air. Conversations that had once flowed freely now seemed measured, careful, as if everyone was testing the waters of this new reality. I watched quietly, savoring the subtle shifts in demeanor. My son's jaw was set, the tightness around his eyes betraying both surprise and the realization that the rules of engagement had changed. I could see my daughter-in-law restraining a frown, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of her napkin. The deed had not only disrupted the dinner, it had rewritten the narrative of authority at this table, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. I remembered the effort that had led to this moment. Months of quietly preparing, making sure every document was in order, every legal nuance accounted for. The patience required had tested my restraint, forcing me to observe without acting, listen without reacting, and anticipate rather than confront. Looking at my family now, I felt a quiet pride, not from triumph over them, but from the knowledge that foresight, strategy, and composure could create change without a single raised voice. It was a reminder that power often manifests most strongly when it is understated and deliberate. There were flashes of doubt in the room, subtle but undeniable. I caught my son glancing at his spouse, seeking reassurance, a silent signal that he was processing more than just the immediate action of the deed. The quiet had become a canvas, upon which every gesture and glance was magnified. I realized then that the deed's power lay not only in the legal statement it carried but in the psychological pause it enforced, a moment of reflection where assumptions of control were suspended and the reality of preparation and intent became unavoidable. I could hear my niece whispering to her cousin, words meant to be discreet yet fully audible to those around her. The tone was a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, and I recognized it immediately from my own younger years, the way children instinctively notice shifts in authority, even when adults try to mask them. That subtle observation confirmed the ripple effect of the deed. The acknowledgement of authority and respect was spreading, quietly, almost imperceptibly, through layers of perception and habit. Every small glance, every careful movement carried the weight of this shift. Reflecting further, I thought about my own past missteps, the times I had attempted confrontation in moments of emotion, only to see the results evaporate under tension or resentment. This moment, by contrast, was deliberate, methodical, and calculated. I had chosen my timing, my approach, and my method with precision. The deed was more than an object. It was the culmination of years of strategic patience, a symbol of endurance and careful planning. I understood that authority reclaimed quietly can resonate far longer than victories won through immediate force or confrontation. My daughter-in-law's expression flickered between frustration and reluctant acknowledgement. I sensed a shift within her, though subtle, as if the act had pierced through assumptions of entitlement. The quiet observation of others had amplified its impact. The social proof of recognition by multiple family members reinforced the unspoken lesson. In that moment, I realized the power of subtle strategy, not as a tool for revenge, but as a mechanism for respect, recognition, and eventual reconciliation. The deed was both a statement and an invitation, a challenge to reconsider assumptions and a bridge toward a more equitable understanding. I noticed my son shifting in his chair, attempting to regain composure. The tension had not entirely lifted, but the atmosphere was no longer one of simple defiance or casual disregard. There was a silent recalibration, a reconsideration of what authority, respect, and acknowledgement meant in our family dynamic. I could feel the subtle anxiety mixed with introspection, the beginning of a mental negotiation as each person silently assessed their position and the consequences of the evening's events. Even as dessert arrived, the quiet energy persisted. Each gesture, each bite, carried a heightened sense of awareness. The deed had reframed the evening, but the social and emotional aftermath was still unfolding. I found myself observing the small details, the slight hesitation before a comment, the careful modulation of tone, the unspoken questions and glances exchanged across the table. These micro-moments were the true indicators of impact, more than words or immediate reactions. It was a study in human behavior, framed by dignity, restraint, and the power of preparation. Reflecting internally, I realized the depth of my own transformation in this scenario. Years of subtle exclusion had given way to a moment of intentional authority. Yet, this wasn't about vengeance or domination. It was about establishing boundaries, reclaiming respect, and teaching through quiet, undeniable action. I could feel a sense of calm, a satisfaction born not from immediate drama, but from the measured impact of foresight and restraint. The evening's tension, though still present, had evolved into a space where awareness, reflection, and respect could coexist. I thought about what the next days would bring. Conversations would inevitably revisit this evening, and I understood that the echoes of this moment would extend far beyond the immediate gathering. Each family member had been subtly invited to reconsider behaviors, assumptions, and dynamics. The deed had established a precedent, one that would shape interactions moving forward, a tangible reminder that respect is not granted automatically, but earned through careful attention, thought, and integrity. The quiet moments at the table continued to unfold. Even small gestures, passing a dish, offering a smile, making eye contact, now carried nuanced meaning. The deed had altered perception, reminding everyone present that actions, preparation, and foresight can communicate authority more powerfully than words alone. I felt a sense of resolution settling in, not in a dramatic or final sense, but in the acknowledgement that the narrative had shifted, and the path to recognition and respect had been quietly, effectively established. As the evening drew to a close, I reflected on the broader lesson embedded in this experience. Authority, respect, and recognition often arrive through subtle, intentional actions rather than dramatic confrontation. The deed was a manifestation of strategy, patience, and foresight, proof that quiet planning can create change that resonates deeply. I felt a renewed sense of confidence, not in dominating others, but in reclaiming dignity and teaching through deliberate example. The subtle power of the evening lingered, a quiet yet undeniable shift that would influence interactions for years to come. Even as the evening wound down, I could sense that the ripples of the deed were far from settled. The kitchen, once my temporary refuge, had become a vantage point from which I could observe the quiet shifts in family dynamics. My son lingered near the doorway, debating whether to approach or retreat, while my daughter-in-law carefully avoided direct eye contact, as though acknowledging the deed's weight without admitting it aloud. The air was thick with unspoken questions, tentative reconciliations, and the lingering tension of disrupted expectations. I realized that moments like these, though subtle, carry a gravity far greater than any verbal confrontation. They reshape relationships in ways that words alone cannot. I reflected on the months of preparation leading to this night. There had been evenings spent quietly reviewing legal documents, nights of internal debates about timing, and endless rehearsals in my mind about how to act without inflaming tempers. Every detail mattered: the arrangement of the table, the timing of the gesture, the way the deed would be presented. What seemed like a single moment of action had actually been the culmination of patience, observation, and careful strategy. The quiet triumph lay not in immediate recognition, but in the way the act demanded acknowledgement, consideration, and reflection from everyone present. As I walked back toward the main room, I noticed subtle glances exchanged across the table. My family was processing, recalculating their assumptions about authority, respect, and what it meant to truly value someone's foresight. My niece's eyes met mine briefly, a spark of understanding and curiosity flashing before she looked away. The youngest generation seemed more attuned to the lessons of patience and strategy than those who had assumed unquestioned control. It was a reminder that influence often works in layered, unexpected ways, shaping perspectives in moments no one else even notices. The quiet in the room was punctuated by small gestures that spoke volumes. My son hesitated before offering a toast, carefully choosing his words. My daughter-in-law adjusted a chair with measured care, her movements now more deliberate than hurried. These micro-actions, subtle as they were, indicated an awareness of the shift that had occurred. The deed had transformed the table from a site of exclusion into a place where observation, respect, and reflection now mattered more than mere entitlement or custom. I felt a deep satisfaction, tempered by the understanding that transformation is a gradual process, and the evening's actions were only the opening step. I took a moment to consider my own feelings. There was no jubilation, no gloating, only a quiet sense of clarity and control that comes from acting with intentionality. The act of presenting the deed had been both an assertion and a test, a way to gauge the reactions of those around me and to establish boundaries without overt conflict. It was an exercise in dignity, patience, and self-respect, demonstrating that influence often derives not from confrontation but from careful preparation and timing. As the night deepened, conversations began to resume, tentative and cautious at first. I noticed my son speaking in softer tones, carefully weighing his words. My daughter-in-law's posture relaxed slightly, and even the younger family members seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The evening, once filled with exclusion and subtle resentment, had transformed into a space of quiet reflection. The deed's presence had forced everyone to confront assumptions, to reconsider behaviors, and to acknowledge the power of intentional action. I reflected on what this moment would mean in the long term. The night was not just about a single act of asserting authority. It was about establishing a precedent for future interactions. The quiet power of patience, strategy, and foresight had made its mark, and the lessons would echo in conversations, decisions, and behaviors in the days, months, and years to come. It was a reminder that true authority is earned through deliberate actions, and that respect cannot be demanded but must be recognized through consistency, integrity, and wisdom. By the time the last guests departed, the room had settled into a calm, reflective state. The tension had not vanished entirely, but it had shifted from immediate conflict to contemplative acknowledgement. I understood that the evening's act, the presentation of the deed, had created a lasting imprint, a subtle realignment of familial dynamics that would influence relationships long after the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed. As I cleaned up the remnants of the dinner, I allowed myself a quiet sense of accomplishment. The deed had served its purpose, not as a weapon, but as a catalyst for reflection, recalibration, and potential reconciliation. I realized that the greatest victories often arrive quietly, without fanfare, leaving behind a deeper understanding of authority, respect, and dignity. The evening had not concluded the family's journey, but it had initiated a new chapter, one in which intentional action, patience, and strategic foresight commanded recognition and subtly reshaped the path forward. Looking back on the night, I felt a profound sense of closure mixed with anticipation. The deed had altered perceptions, recalibrated expectations, and reminded everyone present that actions carry consequences beyond the immediate moment. The quiet power of strategy, dignity, and foresight had been validated. I understood that this experience would ripple through the family, influencing interactions, decisions, and relationships in subtle but meaningful ways for years to come. As the Christmas lights flickered faintly across the room, I realized the weight of silence and preparation had finally paid off. I wasn't just reclaiming a piece of paper. I was reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and a long-overlooked truth. The laughter, the whispers, the subtle glances. They all seemed smaller now, dwarfed by the quiet confidence I carried to the table that night. In the end, it wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to myself that respect can't be demanded, it must be earned, and sometimes it must be claimed with quiet courage. I had learned that family can betray, ignore, or belittle, but no one can take what you know is rightfully yours if you stand firm. And just when I thought the night had revealed everything, I remembered another story. One where ownership and authority were challenged in the most unexpected ways. If you think this confrontation was the final battle, wait until you see how far people will go when they believe the rules are on their side. There's a moment that flips everything upside down, and it makes you question who truly holds the power in a family.